Welcome to SenseMaker Sessions, our series where collective Content MD Tony Hallett gets to sit down with the leaders and experts shaping B2B content and dig into ROI, AI, TL, and all the acronyms in between. This episode's guest is Liz Bolshaw, Global Content Strategist and Editorial Lead at EY. Someone who's truly done it all, with her incredible career journey spanning journalism, publishing, and data analytics and so much more. She brings it all to bear on where thought leadership is headed next. Touching on GTLI's Promise and Peril report, the key differences between producers and consumers of content, why relevance is muscling in as content's fourth R, and how thought leadership is really a contact sport. Shout out to our friends at High Beam Global for sponsoring these episodes. They're a leading market research firm that can help you make smarter decisions informed by insights, just like these SenseMaker interviews. Find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
So today's SenseMaker is someone we've been trying to get on the show for a while. I really want to mention Liz Bolshaw from EY. Great to have you here.
Thanks very much, Tony. It's great to be here.
Good. Well, we're going to get into a whole range of things. I think as our audience knows by now, we like to really hear about your career and how you got to this point. And we've got a lot of meat to really get into around the future of thought leadership, AI, inevitably. You've been very, very close to some great research that's come out. We're going to get to all of that. Who knows where this will go to? But as I say, been looking forward to it. So first of all, Liz, your career arc, if I could summarize it really, really briefly, I would say publishing, journalism, and then into consulting with the big four around thought leadership, which you're known for. But let's go back to that beginning then, and the original job that sort of got you into the world of content and knowledge and using that big brain.
So I had no plan at all for my career. I literally didn't know what to do. And I read English at Cambridge. I got a first, and the default position was that you do research and you'd become an academic. And I thought that's probably pretty much what I would do. But I decided to take a year off and went and taught English in a very strange, bizarre school in France. And I drank a lot of fabulous wine. And after about 3 or 4 months, I thought, I don't think I'm going to go back to libraries. And a friend of mine was working at Hodder & Stoughton, which was in those days a big, typical family-run British publisher. And she'd been applying for a job that she wasn't getting, but she wasn't rejected either. And I said, I bet I could get that job. And we did it. We had a kind of bet. I knew nothing about publishing. I certainly had no real ambitions to be a publisher. I was offered the job, and I actually almost immediately absolutely loved it. So it was a very collegiate atmosphere. I joined as commissioning editor in the academic division. Mm-hmm. And we were doing all kinds of things. We were doing, monographs, textbooks. We published The Lancet. We published a whole load of journals. So it's all different things. And you learnt very quickly to be a little bit knowledgeable about a lot of things. You had to be curious. Yeah. I was meeting, some absolutely brilliant minds all the time, people who were at the head of their field. Sometimes it was a problem because almost everybody in an academic career wants to get published. And I think it was Christopher Hitchens said, yes, it's true that everybody has a book in them, but in most cases, that's where they should stay. And that is a problem. You get a huge, impetus. And I thrived there. I absolutely loved it. I moved up until I was managing director of that division. Yep. And I was quite young. I was the first woman they'd ever made a director. It was an very old-fashioned firm. And I think, I had 10 wonderful years. And then I just, as often happens, I thought, now what?
Something else. But what a grounding, all of that.
It was great grounding.
My God. And then I think going into journalism, I think I'm right in saying people would know you as Liz Bolshaw at the FT. But there's more to it than that, clearly.
Yeah, and I'd written odd things for the FT, mm-hmm. for as a sort of freelance, as a sideline. But I then joined Casper de Bono, who's the sort of business head at the FT, was then preparing for the FT to move from 5 physical editions to basically the digital 24/7 platform that we know
I
today.
remember that changeover very well.
And
Yeah.
it was a huge shift in culture, and it had all sorts of issues. And I was just dragged into a very small kind of SWAT team, but it was excellent, excellent experience. And after that, I got a job, and I was joined their sort of management team, and I worked with two people, Mike Skapinka and Andrew Hill, and did a lot of interviewing, lots and lots of management pieces, bits on business schools, and again, really collegiate atmosphere, wonderful space where you had people who were very young and junior, but had exactly the same respect as somebody who'd been there for 20 years, and I admired that. It was all about your writing, and that was great.
Yeah, and I think we share that love, that kind of the minutiae of getting into the writing and editing, and your peer group complimenting you on the smallest thing. It's an amazing, quality bar, if nothing else. And then clearly, the third act, going into the world of consulting, the big four. I know what those other worlds would then bring into that kind of career, and into what we now call thought leadership. Maybe we even did then, but it's cemented now. Tell us then how you got to EY.
Well, I was telephoned. I was just phoned up, and would I be interested in a job at EY? And I said, no way would I ever work for an accounting firm, which just shows you mustn't take anything I say seriously. And I can't remember how many times I told them to go away, but it was quite a lot. And then finally, chap who's no longer there, a guy called Simon Rhodes, said, look, just meet me for coffee, which is, by the way, something you never do if you're not interested in joining jobs, because of course once I'd done that I felt I was somehow in, and
Right.
I don't regret it at all. I mean, I joined as a senior analyst, working on their sort of entrepreneurship beat, and obviously it's a huge brand for EY because we do World Entrepreneur of the Year. So I went to Monaco every year and met some absolutely amazing entrepreneurs, really at the sort of cusp of the beginning of their journey. So it was a way of discovering the brands of the future, and I absolutely loved it. And then I after about 4 years, as often happens, got a bit bored, left, did my own thing for a bit, and was called back again. This is a new role. They were changing the way we do thought leadership, making it increasing the governance model. Obviously, we're a federation of many firms, but this was going to be global, and really a sort of central part for all of our thought leadership to elevate quality. And I was intrigued because I felt there was a genuine opportunity in bringing journalistic skills, understanding the analyst role, and bringing all that together with my editorial background seemed to me to be decent.
Yeah,
Decent basis.
More than decent. I think again though, at EY, you've worn more than one hat until you've got to this position now as the global director of content and more. And it feels like that everything that had happened in your career to that point would have meant you probably weren't phased, or was it just really different going to that sort of commercial, big four environment?
I don't think I've ever really been phased too much by anything. I mean, I think Kierkegaard is right. You have to look back at your life to make sense of it, but you live it forwards. And I think I've always lived things forward. I'm not really bothered too much by change. And because I'd done interviewing of really the greatest CEOs in the world, there weren't many people who would really faze me. I think now there's a lot of technology to get your head around, and you learn a lot from. I learn far more from young people in the office than I do from some of our senior partners, to be fair.
Okay. Well, maybe we can get into that a bit, and I think we will, certainly around some of the aspects of AI, which we'll come to. I wanted to move on to all aspects of thought leadership, but I've seen you present a few times, and one of the things that you do is you cite the World Trade Uncertainty Index. So tell us a bit about that. The phrase that always comes to mind, or the quote that comes to mind, is from uncertain to, quote, predictably unreliable. And this, to me, feels like the foundation for so much of what's going on now, is this, shifting sands that never stop shifting under our feet, which makes it very hard to do anything. Why do you cite that so much?
Well, I think it has a direct relationship to why clients look to thought leadership. So I think in periods of uncertainty, you can't rely on the past to give you a map for the future. Mm-hmm. And that's been true for really quite a long while. But what's different now, I think, is everybody knows the one thing they can be certain of is that it's going to be different. change is an absolute 100% certainty. And that is a shift.
Hmm.
And the volatility is accelerated, it's happening much faster. It's bigger, it's more complex because a lot of change is interrelated with other changes, and some of those domino impacts are quite difficult to predict. And I think clients are, they're looking for advice, they're looking for guidance, and thought leadership is there really to give them that.
Yeah, and looking for people that they can really trust in a world where trust has really fallen apart in many areas. We talked about journalism, we haven't talked about politics, lots of places. But I think one of the things you come back to is actually, if you look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, trusting corporations, maybe counterintuitively in some places, is actually held quite strong. And therefore, thought leadership has its opportunity.
Yeah, and personally, I think that's because of authenticity. Because I think most people know that corporations are there to make profit, so it's transparent.
Right.
The problem sometimes with politicians and indeed lots of public bodies is that transparency is not there, and so people they sniff something and they don't like it. Whereas I think businesses and corporations have now, they do hold some trust, and I think we have some responsibility to make sure that we live up to that trust.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why you and I and many of us tend to be quite bullish about the opportunity for thought leadership. Earlier this year in February, I was there when you launched a report, which I know you can tell us about. You're one of the founder board members of the Global Thought Leadership Institute, and this is a GTLI report called Promise and Peril. You'll tell me the full title. And I wanted to really get into that because there's lots of aspects of that. So please tell us about what the sort of top brass around the world in the research was saying about thought leadership. Start there. How is it valued?
So the title, Promise and Peril, was really looking at AI and thought leadership, and the two things. On the one hand, promise, because AI gives us all kinds of tools that I think really augment what we're doing and can really deepen the kind of insight that we're able to do, as well as speed it up. Peril, because as we all know, AI tools are not perfect, and I think the other peril is that we all sound the same. There's a homogenization at the moment going on with content, and how we manage to be differentiated and to have some kind of unique perspective, I think is the peril side, is the important thing. So what we did was we surveyed about 1,000 CXOs across the world, about 20 countries, across different industries, and we asked very similar questions to a much smaller group of thought leadership producers. So you got both sides, similar questions, and kind of how they were using AI, what clients felt about the use of AI. And what we really found was very divergent opinions from those two groups.
Yeah, and so let's get into that. So if we call them, because this is what you call them, the producers and the consumers being the very high level CXO in business setting, and the producers being people like you and people like agencies like us who support people like you, and maybe some others as well. So first of all, what were some of the big differences? And I think we can throw up a chart to do with this right now that very easily shows where some of the big differences are. But where would you start?
Well, I think I'd start with the question of quality. So as most people will know, Source Global Research does an annual ranking of thought leadership based on a sample of each major firm's output in a year. And the metrics they use for that ranking are not only widely considered to be, best of breed, but also, most of us have versions of a similar metric. We do. And so there's a sense of, we all know what quality smells like. We know what it's like, whether it's ours or somebody else's. We know the research has to be robust. We know that it needs to be really well structured and well written. We know that data visualization needs to be well done so that it's clear and it tells a good story. And we want to make sure that at the end of reading something that there are clear actions to be taken. But what we found when we asked people to rank those different metrics was an enormous, very, very rapid divergence. So we start at the top, which was the depth of insight, and both producers and consumers agree that's the number one most important thing.
We're agreed on that at least.
But as soon as you go down from there, you find some big divergences. So one of the things that stood out for me was the fact that for our clients, for consumers, they really need actionable advice. That
Yeah.
is, I think, was the fourth most important
Yep.
quality standard. It was way down the list.
Producers think it's seventh out of the eight
Exactly.
things. Yeah.
Producers worry about, does it look great? Does
Right.
it, how much does our brand come through this? Those kind of things.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, clients are not so worried about that.
Right.
So I think it was a really interesting chart and a really interesting in-depth look at actually how thought leadership is being used, because in the end we are all doing thought leadership for similar, the classic 3 R's, reputation, relationships and revenue still stands, although I think now relevance has become a 4th R. But we're maybe thinking about it in a slightly skewed way, and the utility or the actionability of the advice we give, I think, is something that's really important. We can no longer just say we're doing a piece of thought leadership because it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's not enough.
Yeah. And so I think that's an absolute touchstone for everyone listening and watching going forward is make this actionable. And I know in terms of the Promise and Peril report, I've asked you before about how maybe younger cohorts are seeing the use of AI and want to use it as producers and consumers. And I think there's a bit of skepticism and negativity in the last year or so more so than before. How do you see that?
So I think there are probably 2 prongs to that question for Gen Z particularly, and one is a fear that their jobs are going, and they are going. I mean, we shouldn't shy away from this. I mean, the shrinkage of executive graduate jobs in executive arena is really quite dramatic.
Right.
And I think one of the questions that we're asking, and many firms like ours are asking, is how do you compensate for not having that typical apprenticeship model where you spend a lot of years just in the weeds, but you learn a lot as a result of that? How do you provide that learning when you don't need people to spend, boring hours munching through data?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good question, and I think it's one that AI can probably help us solve. But the other thing I think is that young people tend to be they tend to have played around with tools more probably than older people.
Yeah.
And they have found them sometimes lacking. I mean, we're looking at still very young technologies. I think we sometimes forget how, some of these, I mean, you think about ChatGPT, I mean, it's not very long ago that it was launching. And here we are, and it's so much better than it was. But that's not to say that there aren't glitches. It's not to say that we shouldn't still, have a professional skepticism sometimes to what we're seeing. If something doesn't feel right, we need to go into it. And I think that's, for young people, I think they need to feel they can do that, and they need to be helped, I think, in how to use AI tools in a responsible way.
And I think having a healthy attitude to skepticism, not just seeing it as cynicism, but critical thinking. And I think a lot of people are happy to point at the emperor wearing no clothes and saying, well, this is rubbish. And that happens a lot in, I think, people's daily lives. And I know the younger cohorts I know are very much not afraid to say, well, this is BS, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Let's embrace that. So we all know, I think a lot of the listeners here will know that AI can be used for many different aspects of what we do. However, for a lot of the past 2 years, we've been having non-stop conversations with people who assume AI's main use is around generating content. In the chart, which again I'm looking at still, and we can throw back up on screen, the question: the extent to which content is AI generated. Consumers gave it put it 5th. Producers put it 8th. So it's saying that the consumers of content do care whether what's in front of them has been, spun up using AI. And there were some quite sort of damning figures around people rejecting, not wanting to do business with your whole brand. If they think that.
And I think you're absolutely right. There was generally very negative sentiment on the use of AI in thought leadership. And I think one of the reasons for that is if you think about how LLMs have largely been used across business, it's been to optionalize, be more efficient, be faster, make things cheaper and quicker. And I think clients are responding to that too and saying, well, if it's just a question of doing something fast and shallow, that's not important to me. What I want to know is the nitty-gritty insight, the real depth that I can use for competitive advantage. So I think there's a story to tell that producers, and I would include EY in this, have yet to really meet that challenge, that we have to tell the story about why AI has enriched a piece of work. All the things we can do now that we wouldn't have been able to do even 5 years ago. We can interrogate enormous data sets. We can look at correlations and patterns between public information and maybe some proprietary data that we happen to have, whether it's survey based or whether it's our client work. And there's a whole range of insight that can come out of that that we wouldn't have been able to do in the past, but we're not telling that story.
So it's that insight, and as you say, telling the story of to clients, prospects, the wider world, that hey, this is how we're using AI. We're not just transparent, but we're saying specifically this is what we can do that we couldn't do before.
Yeah,
that is critical. I'm going to plug our own research as well because our State of AI in Thought Leadership report. From very, very recently, because one of the things that absolutely came out was one of the few really recorded benefits of using AI was speeding up the process. And I think our point of view on that is very much just don't use that extra time you get back just to produce more of the same. Do that differentiation, try and produce something that the world needs and no one else is producing. And I think that really answers your beware the sea of sameness line that I've heard from you. So yes, let's keep moving on, because this is massively interesting. I've heard you talk about thought leadership, how it's really in recent years has been dominated by a rather small number of very large organizations. But you said that there's definitely an opportunity for small niche producers, especially in this age of AI. Where do you see the biggest opportunities?
Well, I think for all sorts of reasons now, being an expert in a small field is really important. So I think small producers can occupy niches that may have been ignored by bigger operators. In the past, just scale and resources were very critical to do big pieces of research. You needed to spend a lot of money, and you needed to have a very big team of often pretty well qualified people. I think that's less of an issue now, because I think AI tools allow you to do fantastic data visualizations. They allow you to do analysis of big data sets really well. And you can start to say, okay, so many of these important metrics that we've been talking about, I can hit those just using tools, not by having an enormous team. But I think the big opportunity for smaller operators is niches. So be an expert in your hometown. Don't be a tourist in everybody else's place.
Right.
And then the other side of it is maybe you can be faster, because organizations that are large do not tend to be fast. We have, and I think we're not alone, big consultative processes, a lot of people that have to agree something, and that takes time. But I think if you're small and you're agile and you have only a few people, you can be bolder, you can take a point of view, and you can do it fast. And actually speed now, given the way the world is moving, I think is a real important quality.
Yeah, and I think there's been different research on this, but the smaller organizations, it's been a case of often the ability, so resource, cost, which is kind of all related, maybe not such a problem for an EY of this world. But for the bigger organizations and your peer group and the big producers that I'm sort of alluding to there, like governance tends to be more of so it's that sense of like there's so much complication, so much sign off, et cetera, that you don't tend to be fast. So coming at it from different ends, I guess.
Yeah, and you don't tend to be fast, but the other problem is you don't tend to be bold, because the more people you ask, if you ask 150 people the color of your sitting room wall, I guarantee you will end up with a sort of beigey kind of off-white, because it is the least offensive. And that happens with thought leadership, unfortunately, is what you end up with is this sea of sameness, is where everybody can say, well, we're not going to object to that. But if you're small, you can be bolder, and we know clients want bold. They want a bold point of view. They want to be surprised, and they want to be kind of to look at something through new eyes. I think it's the great Proust quote that, the voyage of discovery, or the business of discovery, is not in discovering new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. And I think that's what we all need to do more of, which is actually to look at these old problems, because many of them are old, but with new eyes, and really trying to take a different angle in. That's the opportunity. I
Yeah,
think.
I'm also conscious we're going from Hitchens to Kierkegaard to Proust. This is the most highbrow of the podcasts, I think, that we've done yet, which is all good. Please keep it coming. So I was just thinking to what you were saying there about the being bold and the opposite of the sea of sameness. So it strikes me that the use of AI can be about, some people say white space, that perhaps doesn't do this justice, but trying to do something that no one else is doing. I think it's fair to say that EY, together with your peer set and a number of other very impressive organizations, tend to have things that you're known for. There'll be those kind of set pieces through a year where everyone knows, okay, these guys are the best at this. And you probably know that's probably not where you're going to go, is what your competitor is doing. But there are probably whole areas out there which are ripe for some great research, thought leadership, insight, you name it.
No, absolutely. And I think it's an interesting thing, innovation at the moment, because it's, on the one hand, as I said, being an expert in your hometown, knowing what you really are good at, and you are alone very good at. And I love the example of Corning, the big US firm that, first of all, they discovered, or they made heat-proof glass. So our grandparents' cook shelves were all full of Pyrex, and Pyrex came out of Corning. And I think it was sort of in the certainly early 21st century, 25th, I think 1915, something like that. And they then went into Gorilla Glass, and they did glass for iPhones and other smartphones. And now they are making the cabling, which again is taking high density data into data centers, because there's a heat issue with high density. And so all the technology that is in that firm's DNA, going right back to 1915. Somebody will correct me.
Early 20th century.
Early then. To today. Is a line that you can draw through it. It's a red thread you through it. But they are responding to a completely different operating environment and seeing an opportunity. And I think that's the key, is all the time looking at how a new context can give you a new opportunity.
Indeed. Okay, so I wanted to sort of just come back to the Promise and Peril report again, just around expectations. So if we're thinking about what we should be doing and serving all kinds of companies around the world, but especially some of the biggest who are buying from other big companies, this idea that we have to be extremely careful around AI usage ourselves and try and use it in some of these innovative ways that we've now got into, but careful about how somebody wants to consume. And I'm just wondering if part of the peril is not how we use AI to do anything. It's how the business leaders are using AI to synthesize, to do daily digests, and our brand might disappear, right? We might, if we're lucky, get a good citation. That's a completely different paradigm, isn't it? How do we sort of talk about ourselves in that world?
Well, I think the question of discoverability of content has really, really changed the last couple of years. And I think all of us have seen the impact of that. So, with decent SEO, you could pretty much guarantee that you would be on the first page of a Google search. It wasn't difficult to do that. Now, to be cited and to be visible, there's a whole new range of metrics that you need to hit. And a lot of them are good quality things. So, having how many links do you have out? How many times are you cited by a credible source? How many other pieces on a similar subject have you got around that central piece? In other words, have you just got one piece on cybersecurity, or have you got 8? And those things are beginning to really impact on your own reputation, if you like, your content reputation. And LLMs, in this case, are consumers. They are reading. They're not necessarily reading as we do, but they are. That is an audience.
Did you see The Economist thing with the 2 versions of their website?
Yes.
So one for LLMs.
Yes.
Which we never see, hopefully. But
and that's it. And I think how you maintain some kind of brand identity in this new world is a question. I don't think any of us have got the answer to that, but it certainly is a question. But on the other hand, it's very important to be seen. The other thing we've noticed is that LLMs also index high on specialist titles. So there was a time when Sheep Shearing Weekly wasn't big on our list of tier 1 media. But it may well be, or if we're doing agritech or something in the future, because if it has, from an LLM perspective, it is the instrument
Right.
in that particular field.
Yeah.
They will index that higher. So I think this question of being an expert in a niche, going back to smaller producers, is something that AI is actually helping.
Yeah.
One thing AI doesn't like is going very broad and very shallow.
Yeah.
Ironically, what LLMs actually are really good at doing, which
Right.
is to provide you with a good overview of a topic. You'll do that really well, summarize something very fast. What they're not good at doing is going deep and recognizing complexity and nuance. And that's where I think thought leadership producers have an opportunity.
And again, back in the spirit of what's old becomes new again, there's been a little bit of a talk of a renaissance in things like earned media, because if you're trying to appear in The Economist and places like the FT, you name it, then PRing to get in there becomes pretty important again. Are you seeing some of that going on?
Oh yeah, I mean, earned media has always been a proxy for quality for us, and I think for most people who are in the game. But I think it is more and more important, and particularly with those tier one media that have no fear and favour. They really are independent. You can't pay to be cited. And I think, because so much now, with influencers and social media, so much is paid for fundamentally. It's commercially driven. The standing and the reputation of earned media becomes even more important.
Yeah. Have you traditionally worked closely with the people in press and media relations?
We do, yeah, and especially with some of our more major pieces and some of our more newsworthy things. I mean, we do, we have a geostrategic business group, which we have a lot of things that have to do with geostrategy.
Right. So as the world is changing, it's
geopolitics, and that tends to be newsworthy. Not everything we do is very newsworthy, but that certainly is. And so we would want to make sure that we're talking to our media team to make sure the storylines that we've got are exciting from their point of view and they think they can sell them in. Yeah.
And one other thing I know you've said is that you've described thought leadership as a contact sport. What does that mean?
Well, I think particularly with AI, the danger is you have sort of cognitive atrophy. You are no longer really engaged with the content because it's doing a job for you. You've got an agent, you've built an agent, it's doing a really good job, it's going around, it's finding research. It's a contact sport because you still need to engage with that content. And indeed, you have to make sure that you're involving all the experts in your firm, in your organisation, and quite often outside your organisation. I mean, we have a lot of alliance partners who are really critical for some of the things we do. So in that sense, it's a contact sport. Never forget that. Never sort of stand back and let AI do it all. I think that's where the peril, the danger lies.
Love that. This is such a great conversation. I want to bring it back to something personal to you, just for us to wrap this up. And we'd love to speak to you again. Obviously, that goes without saying. But the question we tend to ask people at the end is to do with their career and going back and thinking of yourself. So that high achieving Oxbridge graduate in the early days, how could you have seen the last few decades developing? Would you have ever thought this is where you'd end up?
No, I had no idea where I would end up. I mean, to be fair to me, it's not that I had a raving ambition to be anything particular. I had very little ambition at all. I just.
But curiosity.
But I had curiosity, and I thought that things would turn out right. I've always been quite an optimist.
Okay.
And actually, things have. I mean, I've just been extremely fortunate. I think the thing I would always say is that, I think Hockney's great phrase is that you have to be playful to be alive. And I think play, in its broadest sense, is something, again, particularly if you're working for a big accountancy firm like EY, you can sometimes forget that. And I think it is important to experiment, to be quite lighthearted about a lot of what happens.
Good. Well, please carry on being lighthearted with us and our audience. I want to say, thank you for that audience that's watching and listening. Thank you to our sponsor today, but especially to Liz Bolshaw from EY. Thank you for being today's Sense Maker.
Thanks very much, Tony. I've loved it.
This was the Collective Content Podcast, Sensemaker Sessions. Let us know what you'd like us to make sense of next.